Good morning. Hope you're doing well. What a great time to start our just celebration together. You guys sound amazing there. Sound great. Welcome. I'm Chris, one of the pastors here at our church. And if you're new, you have any sort of question, we would love for you to visit the New Here spot in our lobby. There's also a spot where you checked your kids in, and appreciate you so much helping us with that new flow and walking around. It's going to be great. And any questions, that's the place to go. You can also text, download our app. On our app, you'll see a bunch of stuff for like our holiday season, ways to serve and get involved in the spirit of Christmas and Thanksgiving and it's coming. And we'd just love for you to stay connected through that. Next Sunday, the 19th, you have the advantage as I'm telling you this correctly. Last service, I told them all the wrong information. I couldn't read the screen. And next Sunday is next. So if you have just some desire to have a conversation, to ask some questions, hear more about our church, what we're doing, how you can get involved. If that's been it's something you haven't done yet or it's been challenging, I'd love for you to attend next. It's at 10 o'clock next Sunday. They have donuts, and so that's a pretty amazing opportunity to drink some coffee, eat a Bosa donut. I wish I could go every time. So you should check it out. This afternoon at 1 o'clock, this is actually today, in just a little bit, right across the way in our multi-purpose room in our office building, is AZ127 is hosting what's called Find Your Place in Foster Care. Many of us work under the assumption that in foster care of helping these kids who need a safe and loving home, that the only role to play is be a foster parent. And that's an important role, and we need more people to do that. But there are so many other roles that can be played in this effort to love children. And so if that's something you just want to learn more about, it's no obligation. Get the information, have some conversation. It's at 1 o'clock, and a great, great opportunity that we really get to do because of the financial and volunteer support of so many people in our church family. It's just one of many things that happens around here. Our support of AZ127, the work we do around foster and kinship care and adoption. Thank you for making that happen. As you came in, you should have gotten a little bit of a budget update for our church family. If you're like brand new, this is your first time, you don't need to look at this too much. We're really just to make sure as a church family, those of us that this is where we connect with Jesus and each other, just know where we're at. Often I get like, how are things going? And I think about if I was sitting in the chairs on a regular basis and not sitting up here, what would I want to know as a part of our church? And so we just put that information here. And I'll just help you with one thing that might be confusing. Where it says there in the middle, this kind of line graph above the pie chart, that what that says is that we need $585,000 to be given in our offerings by our church family, all of us, to meet our budget in this year, 2023. And that doesn't mean we're $585,000 in the hole unless everyone who regularly gives money to our church just stopped for 2 months. Then yes, that is where we would be. But where we are is our projections predict that we'll be about $110,000 short of that need. And as I said, if I'm you and I love this church, I just want to know that. Because if you're going to support something this year, and many of us will be thinking about the end of the year, where can we be generous? Where can we bless our community or an organization? If you're thinking about that, you're wondering, where can I take a mandatory IRA distribution and give it and save some tax dollars? I would just ask you to think about supporting our church. Because when you do, what we just talked about, foster care and AZ127, you're supporting that great work. All the things we do as a church, you're supporting, but you're also supporting dozens of local and international organizations who tell people about Jesus, who feed hungry people, who give them clothes. They do amazing things. And if you're not involved in that, we'd love for you to help us finish this year strong. We give away almost 20% of what God entrusts to us as a church. And so if you're thinking about this holiday season where you can be generous at the end of the year, just ask God what he'd have you do here at your church. If you're part of another church or another organization, do it there. We would love for you to pray about doing it here. We're in this sermon series. We're coming back to a series we did for several weeks. We took a break to talk about everybody's favorite topic. Now we're back to this conversation around practices for knowing God. And where we're starting is from this verse. Every week I've taught through this. We've used this verse as our starting point, where Jesus is saying in John 17, this is eternal life. That they, and we're the they, that people to come would know you, God, the only true God, and Jesus whom you have sent. That's what Jesus' definition of life, the good life, is that we would know God. And so we've talked about prayer. We've talked about the Bible, how to interact with Scripture. We actually talked about those each twice. We've talked about serving, Sabbath, because we do those things to know God more. Because what we've been going from this point, this is kind of like our guiding principle of this series. Knowing God is greater than knowing about God. Knowing him in a real, interactive, personal way. And so today I want to look at generosity as a practice for knowing God. We're going to do 3 new practices, and then we'll go into the Advent season. And to be generous, this is our definition. This is just what I want you to kind of have in mind as we talk about how is generosity a practice for knowing God. And being generous is when we show a readiness to give more of something, our time, our money, than is strictly necessary or expected. That's just from the dictionary. Somebody is generous when they're willing to do more than the minimum. And our default, maybe your default, especially in a church context, right, is we think about generosity to simply money, which is a valid conversation. It's part of what we're going to look at, but it's not all we're going to look at. I want you to just be open to look at it a bit broader. Not to exclude talking about money and financial generosity, but we're going to also talk about being generous with our time and our attention. In our life group, a few weeks ago, we were going through the curriculum that many of our life groups are doing this fall or just wrapping up. And we asked the question, there's one of the days where we talk about giving and generosity. And the question was asked, when have you been the recipient of generosity? It was so great and so encouraging to just listen to our group's answer. Small things were mentioned, some very simple things that the person who gave this gift of generosity probably didn't even realize how big an impact it is mentioned years later. Some very large things were mentioned, very amazing things, actions, sacrifices of time, sacrifices of people's attention. People in our group were talking about being seen in moments where they just needed someone to pay attention to them, and they received that generous gift. And also things that had a financial value. They were all mentioned. It was such a fun conversation. When have you been the recipient of someone else's generosity? I want you to think about it, not just sit in that for a moment. When have you experienced in your life the generous gift of someone's time, and it made such a difference? Or it was money or a financial thing. It had a value to it. Or they just paid attention and they noticed you and you needed to be noticed. When have you experienced that? Just think about it for a moment. Can you feel what it felt like again? Close your eyes if you want. Just sit in that space for a few seconds. What did that generosity do to your relationship with the person who gave it? Can you remember? I think we all have a moment, if we can find it in our memory, of when someone was generous. Did that generosity do anything with your connection to God? See, I believe that living in a posture of generosity is is a way to help us know God. That's why it's in this series, Practices for Knowing God. Because ultimately, all of these practices revolve around our hearts. My clicker quit working. Can you guys go to the next slide? Generosity is a posture of all of our hearts. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus talks about this principle. And he says this, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Now he keeps saying even sinners, right, in this passage. Oh, let's see if we're working yet. Oh yeah, here, we're cooking now. Look, we're all sinners. Like, don't get too hung up on that word. He just means, like, people who are in a different culture, people who aren't trying to follow me, they live life different. Even they do these things. Like, tick for tat is not generosity. But he says this of us as his followers. Oh, I don't love that Jesus said this, but he said it. Love your enemies. I'd much rather not. That's why they're my enemy. But he says, love your enemies. Do good to them. What credit? What? Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. It's like, be free with your finances, your stuff. Then your reward will be great. You will be the children of the Most High. Children of God. Because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. And I assume that's all my enemies. He's talking about ungrateful and wicked. And then I remember, sometimes that's me too. I can be a little ungrateful. Be merciful, just as God is merciful. What was our definition of someone who's generous? Someone who goes above the minimum. You do more than what's expected. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. And then, look, he shows us right here. What happens when you do that? When I do that? We will then be children of the Most High. You see, when I'm generous with people around me, people that nobody but Jesus expects to be generous with, my relationship with God is impacted. I'm his child. See, when we're generous, it connects us with God because that's where we learn generosity. It's from God. And what does a child have? Relationship with their parents. Be like your father. Be merciful. Be generous. We get into selfishness. We get into fairness and scarcity. These are cultural values. These are not from God. He's none of those things with you and me. He doesn't treat us with scarcity or judgment, or he treats us with mercy. And he says, one more verse. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. We don't like to talk about this, but this verse, Luke 6:37 and many others, tell us that if we actually don't forgive, if we judge and we condemn, then that is what we will receive from God. It's not a popular message. It wasn't popular then. It's not popular now. But we have to be generous with these things. With our forgiveness, with our lack of condemnation. And then he says this great picture, this word picture. He says, give. It will be given to you. He's talking about material things now. He says, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured for you. And you got to think of like how things, commodities worked in that day. Today, if you want a pound of flour, you go to your local grocery store, you buy a pound, it's in a bag, it's all tight, and it's like, this is exactly the amount I'm paying for. You take it home. In the time of Jesus, still this place, many parts of the world, you go to a market. You want to buy a pound of flour, you want to buy cups or whatever measuring, you want to buy olive oil or like dates or almonds or whatever it is. You're buying a volume and you have a container of your own that you're going to get the volume you're paying for measured out and poured into your container. And so you'd be at the market, and with flour, we all know how this works. If you just scoop it out and you don't shake it or tamp it down, you get less than you're actually paying for, right? And you imagine if you're holding the container and the person you're buying oil from to cook with or to burn in the lamps to light your home, do you want them to pour just below the rim of the cup that they're measuring with? Not really, right? What do you want? You want them to hold that cup above your lap with your containers. You're sitting there in their shop, and you want them to pour and actually let a little bit go over the edge and pour into your container extra, because that's generous, more than the minimum. And Jesus says, how you measure out what you give is how it'll be measured back to you. And you probably don't sell flour and olive oil on a regular basis, I doubt. But you know who gets this today? The people at Five Guys. You know what I mean, right? If you've been to Five Guys, you know exactly what I'm about to talk about. French fries. You go to Five Guys and you pay for, and I know it's a lot of money, okay? So I get that this is all just how I perceive it, but that's an important lesson. You pay for a cup of French fries. Comes in paper cups, right? And what do the wonderful employees of Five Guys do? They fill up your cup. They dump it out in a paper bag, and they fill it again and put all of it in a paper bag. You get a whole bag of French fries when you order a large fry at Five Guys. I recommend the Cajun fries. They're delicious. Everywhere else I go in town, when I order a large French fry, I just get what holds in the container. I don't get a whole bunch in the bag overflowing. It feels fairly generous to me. How do you measure? How do you measure the things you share? Because generosity is when you and I go beyond what is expected. And since it's a way to know God more, let's talk about how we can do it. How can you and I be more generous with our time? Time. It might be our most valuable, precious commodity in our world, right? You're busy. I'm busy. We don't have much of it. I was listening to Will, who's our children's and youth pastor this past week, tell a little bit of a story that I got him to begrudgingly allow me to tell you. Will has 3 kids and is a really busy guy. And the school where his kids go to school at Knowles Elementary started recruiting dads to help with dads being on campus at different times of the day doing different things. Helping in classrooms, I don't even know all of it, maybe recess and lunch. But they're recruiting dads to come and be just a positive influence around the kids. And so he's there not too long ago, and the way he's telling us this story is he didn't really want to be there that particular day. He signs up for this program because he feels like he should be involved at his kid's school. And he's kind of feeling a little salty about it that day. I've been there. I've volunteered for things and thought, what am I doing here? I'm too busy for this. And in the midst of that, just a little bit of feeling that way, he starts a conversation. He's interacting with this 5th grade student, and this boy asks him, why are you doing this? Why are you here? And Will says, well, the leaders of the school wanted more dads to be involved and just helped out. Remember, he's feeling a little grumpy about this. He's got other things to do. And the boy says, oh, that's really cool. I don't have a dad. Right? Like, is Will busy? Yeah. Would anybody look at his life and go, hey, you know what you need to do? Give more time away. Nobody would say that to him. But he felt prompted to serve in this role, to be generous with some of his time at school. And God met him there. It's no coincidence that he has that conversation with a boy who could use a positive male role model in his life, right? Like, God changed his attitude, his heart, because what God was acknowledging, what God was meeting Will in the middle of, was the generosity of his time. When we're generous with our time, we see God doing this sort of thing all over the place. And here's the thing, is my time isn't scarce like yours feels like it is. Mine feels scarce, but then I realize it's only scarce after I commit it all to these other things. And if I'm spending all the time I have on myself, I'm not going to know God more. I'm not going to meet him in this space. Can you justify, like I can, being a little stingy with your time? Absolutely. I do it. I wish I didn't. See, this takes an incredible amount of wisdom. What do I say yes to? What do I say no to? It doesn't mean I can say yes to everything. That's not the point I'm trying to make. It's incredibly complex, but we want a checklist. It just doesn't work that way. We got to take some wisdom into these parts of our lives, and especially, how are we doing with our time? And I need to look at my yeses and see who they serve. Because if all my yeses serve me, they serve my agenda, I'm not being generous. I'm not talking about being burned out or doing more than you can do. We're not Jesus. We can't save everybody's problems. I talked just a couple weeks ago about Sabbath, remember? I'm not contradicting that. But am I generous with my time? And it's a really important question because it's so precious of a commodity to you and me. And is it serving me? Or am I doing things that let me meet God in the middle of it? How do I be generous with my money? This isn't all about money today, but it's an important area to consider with our generosity. The way I understand it, the first 10% of what we have, of what comes into us, our accounts, into our possession, our income, you will, however it gets there, is what God said he wants us to return to him. The first 10%. In church, in the Bible, we call it a tithe. A tithe isn't when you give, it's when you give 10%. You give a tenth. What portion of God's money, because it's all his, and the way that you got it, through a job or through an account, an investment, wherever it showed up from, God did that. And he says, this first portion I want you to return to me. I would just ask you to do this, to start to grow in the generosity of your money. If you don't know already, go home and sometime in the near future, today before you forget, figure out how much of, what do you give to what God wants you to give based on percentage of what he's put into your account. Do you know what percentage it is? And what percentage of what he has given you do you give back to your church or some organization that tells people about Jesus? You don't need to tell anyone. Don't put it on your Facebook. Don't. It's not like to brag or to shame you, but do you know the percentage? Because the way I understand God is he said, start with 10%. And that's obedience. And then we can talk about generosity. So how do you grow? Well, you have to start. You have to know where you are. You have to start somewhere. And maybe it's just simply to start at a percent or to know what percent you are. And then to grow beyond 10% and get into the realm of generosity as God sees it. It's going to require we spend less on ourselves. Our kids, our grandkids, it might require you move to a less expensive home. I mean, that wouldn't be local, And I'm not trying to drive people out of town, but if you're truly trying to honor God and that drives you to live someplace different, to honor him, to be generous, then listen to him, be generous there. To share space or resources with another family, to minimize expenses. I mean, here's a really extreme idea. Skip the next sports tournament and give the money you had spent to an organization telling people about Jesus at the end of this year. LendingTree.com just did a survey. 59% of parents whose children play fall sports say the cost is a financial strain for their family. Sometimes we can't be generous because all the things we're committed to doing, they feel non-negotiable, but they really are options. How can you be more generous with God's money? Last, how can you and I be more generous with our attention? What do you pay attention to? What do you spend your energy focusing on? Better yet, who do you pay attention to? Do some of us need to pay some attention more to our kids and off of our phones? With our neighbors? I bet every single one of us live near somebody who lives alone. Can we do more than just the minimum expectation? Somebody in our apartment complex or in our condo or in our neighborhood on our street. Can we interact with them generously, paying attention? Our attention, is it inward focus, self-focused, or is it available to others? Is it outward? A great place we can practice this, friends, is right here on Sundays. I mean, what a great opportunity to practice the generosity of attention. You're like, what do you mean? Well, when was the last time you met someone new here on a Sunday and started a conversation? Now, this is your first time. That you probably don't have an answer to that. That's okay. But some of us, we've been here a lot of Sundays, and we can't remember the last time we started a conversation with somebody new. I don't mean a conversation with somebody you already know. That's easy. That's fun, right? But what about somebody new? And I know, some of us are like, bro, I'm an introvert, I don't do that. I know, but there's other introverts that they need, you guys need each other. And you'll do it in a way that works. We're gonna have to be a little uncomfortable sometimes, friends, for the sake of people who need connection. For the sake of the people God has put on your heart. Because they may not just show up with you, they might show up at a different service. And don't you want the people at that service to be nice to them? The answer is yes, you do. We need an army of nice to break out here at our church. And we all think we're super nice. We are to the people we know. I just again, a week ago, had a conversation with a family who have some lifelong friends who are disconnected from church. And they've been talking to them and praying for them. And they came. They came for 3 weeks in a row to church with us just in this fall. And they didn't come the same service as their friends who've been inviting them and praying for them. And the greeters in the lobby said hello, and no one else interacted with them for 3 weeks. And they decided not to come back. Friends, we've got to do better. Because that's not our heart, but we're not being generous with our attention. We're doing the minimum. And I know some of you are even going, well, Chris, that's your job. Why didn't you talk to him? What are we paying you to do, man? We got to do this together. Because remember, this is a way to know God more. Because sometimes knowing God more happens when I step into something a little uncomfortable, like starting a conversation with a stranger. It's a practice that creates space for God to show up, to see what happens, to grow in our faith, to start to be generous with our attention as a spiritual practice. Friends, we're just unfortunately being experienced by newcomers lately. The word we used in high school was cliquish, right? And if you were in the popular crowd, you didn't even know there was cliques at your high school. The rest of us did. Let's not let that happen here. We need to turn our attention generously outside of the people we already know or where it's comfortable. We just got to put a stop to the selfish thinking that we can easily slip into here. Skip the conversation with your friends. Don't talk to your favorite pastor. We'll be okay. We'll talk to you later. Just find someone you don't know. I also hear this other thing from people who are new to town that I kind of forgot about. But I experienced it 13 years ago when our family came to Flagstaff. Here's how I'll describe it. And if you're like lifelong Flagstaff person, we need your help with this. Our whole community, not just our church, our whole community has this I'll get to know you in 5 years. Because so many people come and go and move away. Those of us that have been here a while, and I fall into this now, I find myself guilty of it as we think, well, I don't know if I'm going to really invest in that person because they may move in a year or two. And when they've been here 5 years, I'll give them, we'll hang out. There's just this vibe, and new people know what I'm talking about. They could raise their hand and go, yep. We got to do better than that. Why can't we be the people who change that community perspective? People aren't a waste of our time until they've been here 5 years. And if you kind of feel that way, you just got to take that to Jesus, because that's not how he tells us to interact with people. He calls us to love one another. He's calling us to be countercultural, friends. We're a great group of people that do amazing things, and he's saying, pay attention to those who don't feel so comfortable. Be generous with everyone, even these new people. Welcome. So how do we do that? You're here on Sundays. You're here today. How do you even start a conversation to share some of your attention? Here's a couple ideas that came to my mind. If you're getting coffee, and there's other people getting coffee too, you know what you have in common? Coffee. Just ask them, hey, what's your favorite coffee shop in town? It's an easy question, very painless. You're in the hallway and you're picking up kids, your grandkids, whoever, and you're waiting here in a few minutes after church. Just ask the other people, hey, where do your kids go to school? Where do they go to daycare? What are your kids into? Because you have kids in common. How long have you been attending our church? Don't ask people if they're new. I did that once and they were like, I've been here 12 years. I'm like, okay, I'm embarrassed. But how long have you been coming to this church? How long have you lived in Flagstaff? Have you ever hiked the Grand Canyon? I mean, look at people's shoes. If they're wearing hiking shoes, ask them about hiking. Because that's what you want to talk about if that's what you do. Ask somebody, do you like dogs or cats better? And if they say cats, you go talk to somebody else. I'm not kidding, that's what you should do. Some lady last week was, why do you have against cats? I'm like, have you met cats? I don't hurt cats, I just don't want to be around them. Okay, what if you and I started having the assumption that every single person in this room needs more relationships with Jesus followers? Instead of, oh, that's awkward, they probably don't want me to impose. Instead of going, they probably got lots of friends and connections. What if we just assumed they needed one more relationship with a Jesus follower? Because you need one more. It's normal to assume. It's normal to avoid awkward. Let's just step into it. Because when we step into it and we are more generous with these things, we always see Jesus there. We always get to know God more when we give away and we do more than what's expected with our time, our money, our attention. Because it's really this question. When God's given you time, are you open-handed with it? Or do you close fist and clench it? He's given you some of his resources. Are you open-handed? Or are you closed? Holding on to it, trying to own it, control it. Your attention. Is it okay to start some new conversations, to be friendly, to invest in some relationships? You can't predict the outcome. That may not feel great. But when you hold tight, closed-fisted people, we believe in scarcity. That if I am open-handed, I'll lose. And that's not how God's kingdom works. He tells us generosity is greater than scarcity. And those of us, when we step into generosity, we can testify to the truth of this statement. But we then slip back to scarcity sometimes. You know, when we're generous, when I'm generous, I always find myself knowing God more. And not just knowing about him. You'll find it too. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to practice this. I do want to mention that our prayer team will be in the back where they always are. And whether it's around this topic or whatever's happening, you want to pray with someone, they'll be there. They prayed with people last service, they'll do it again. But we're going to end like we always end with this statement. Let's go help one another follow Jesus. But we're going to practice it together. Here's what we're going to do. I've already arranged with the children's ministry. They're going to keep an eye on your kids, if you have kids, for a couple extra minutes. Because we're going to practice some paying attention. So everybody stand up. Everybody stand up. You don't have anywhere to go for a couple minutes. For 2 minutes, I want you to find somebody near you that you don't know and ask one of these 4 questions. You don't have to ask all 4 of them. Don't get weird and creepy on people. But you look around right now and go, hey, I don't know you. You're my person. And for the next 2 minutes, they're going to watch your kids. They're fine. And you're going to just take a moment and meet someone new. And how long have you lived? And how long have you been attending? You ever hiked the Grand Canyon? Give them a high five because they're awesome if they have. Do you prefer cats or dogs? And then decide, do you keep talking or move on? I'm just kidding. It's all good, cat people. Don't get mad at me. All right, you have 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, the music will start up and you can go get your kids and you can be dismissed then. But until then, start having some conversations. Go.